In the final two sections of Chapter 10, we're going to talk about the anti-slavery and abolitionist movement, as well as women's increasing role in social reform. One of the revivalist doctrines of salvation, perfectionism, and disinterested benevolence led many evangelical reformers to believe that slavery was the most God-defying of all sins and the most terrible blight on the moral virtue of the United States. While white men were interested and committed to abolition, and that commitment had existed among some for several decades, organized anti-slavery advocacy had been largely restricted to models of gradual emancipation and conditional emancipation. The colonizationist movement of the early 19th century had drawn together a broad political spectrum of Americans with its promise of gradually ending slavery in the United States by removing the free black population from North America to Africa. Now, for quiz purposes, you need to remember that this rising tide of anti-colonization sentiment among northern free black Americans and middle-class evangelicals' flourishing commitment to social reform truly radicalized the abolitionist movement. Baptists such as William Lloyd Garrison, congressional revivalists like Arthur and Lewis Tappan, and Theodore Dwight Weld, and also radical Quakers including Lucretia Mott, John Greenleaf Whittier, helped push the ideas of immediate emancipation upon the center stage of Northern reform agendas. Inspired by a strategy known as moral suasion, these young abolitionists believed they could convince slaveholders to voluntarily release their slaves by appealing to their sense of Christian conscience. The result would be national redemption and moral harmony, of course. William Lloyd Garrison's early life and career famously illustrated this transition toward immediatism. As a young man immersed in the reform culture of Antebellum, Massachusetts, Garrison had fought slavery in the 1820s by advocating for both black colonization and gradual abolition. But you need to understand where he got his ideas that changed for quiz purposes. He read fiery tracts penned by black Northerners David Walker and James Forten, and this convinced Garrison that colonization was an inherently racist project and that African Americans possessed a hard-won right to the fruits of American liberty. So in 1831, he established a newspaper called The Liberator, through which he organized and spearheaded an unprecedented interracial crusade dedicated to promoting immediate emancipation and black citizenship. Then in 1833, Garrison presided as reformers from 10 states came together to create the American Anti-Slavery Society. They rested their mission for immediate emancipation upon the declaration of our independence and upon the truths of divine revelation, binding their cause to both national and Christian redemption. Abolitionists fought to save slaves and their national soul. That's nice. In order to accomplish their goals, abolitionists employed every method of outreach and agitation. At home in the North, abolitionists established hundreds of anti-slavery societies and worked with long-standing associations of black activists to establish schools, churches, and voluntary associations. Women and men of color, of all colors, were encouraged to associate together in these spaces to combat what they termed color phobia. Harnessing the potential of steam-powered printing and mass communications, abolitionists also blanketed the free states with pamphlets and anti-slavery newspapers. They blared their arguments from podiums and broadsides. Prominent individuals such as Wendell Phillips and Angelina Grimke saturated Northern media with shame-inducing exposés of Northern complicity in the return of fugitive slaves, and white reformers sentimentalized slave narratives that tugged at middle-class heartstrings. Abolitionists used the U.S. Postal Service in 1835 to inundate Southern slaveholders with calls to emancipate their slaves in order to save their souls. And in 1836, they prepared thousands of petitions for Congress as part of the Great Petition Campaign. In the 6 years from 1831 to 1837, abolitionist activities reached dizzying heights. However, such efforts encountered fierce opposition, as most Americans did not share abolitionists' particular brand of nationalism. In fact, abolitionists remained a small, marginalized group detested by most white Americans in both the North and the South. Immediatists were attacked as harbingers of disunion, rabble-rousers who would stir up sectional tensions and thereby imperil the American experiment of self-government. Particularly troubling to some observers was the public engagement of women as abolitionist speakers and activists. Fearful of disunion and outraged by the interracial nature of abolitionism, Northern mobs smashed abolitionist printing presses and even killed a prominent anti-slavery newspaper editor named Elijah Lovejoy. White Southerners, believing that abolitionists had incited Nat Turner's rebellion of 1831, aggressively purged anti-slavery dissent from the region. Violent harassment threatened abolitionists' personal safety. In Congress, they even took action on this. And for quiz purposes, you need to remember that the Whigs and Democrats joined forces in 1836 to pass an unprecedented restriction on the freedom of political expression known as the gag rule, which prohibited all discussions of abolitionist petitions in the House of Representatives. 2 years later, mobs attacked the Anti-Slavery Convention of American Women, throwing rocks through the windows and burning the newly constructed Pennsylvania Hall to the ground. In the face of such substantial external opposition, the abolitionist movement began to splinter. In 1839, an ideological schism shook the foundations of organized anti-slavery. Moral suasionists, led by prominent leader William Lloyd Garrison, felt the U.S. Constitution was a fundamentally pro-slavery document and that the present political system was irredeemable. They dedicated their efforts exclusively towards persuading the public to redeem the nation by reestablishing it on anti-slavery grounds. But for quiz purposes, you need to know that many abolitionists, reeling from the level of entrenched opposition met in the 1830s, began to feel that moral suasion was no longer realistic. Instead, they believed abolition would have to be effected through political processes. So in 1839, political abolitionists formed the Liberty Party under the leadership of James G. Birney. The new abolitionist society was predicated on the belief that the U.S. Constitution was actually an anti-slavery document that could be used to abolish the stain of slavery through the national political system. Women's rights also divided abolitionists. And for quiz purposes, you need to understand that many abolitionists who believed full-heartedly in moral suasion nonetheless felt compelled to leave the American Anti-Slavery Society because, in part, it elevated women to leadership positions and endorsed women's suffrage. This question came to a head in 1840 when Abby Kelly was elected to the Business Committee of the Society. The elevation of women to full leadership roles was too much for some conservative members who saw this as evidence that the society had lost sight of its important goal. Under the leadership of Arthur Tappan, they left to form the American and Foreign Anti-Slavery Society. These disputes became so bitter and acrimonious that former friends cut social ties and traded public insults. Another significant shift stemmed from the disappointments of the 1830s. Abolitionists in the 1840s increasingly moved from agendas based on reform to agendas based on resistance. Moral suasionists continued to appeal to the hearts and minds, and political abolitionists launched sustained campaigns to bring abolitionist agendas to the ballot box. Meanwhile, the entrenched and violent oppositions of both slaveholders and Northern public encouraged abolitionists to find other avenues of fighting the slave power. Increasingly, for example, abolitionists aided runaway slaves and established international anti-slavery networks to pressure the United States to abolish slavery. Frederick Douglass represented the intersection of these two trends. After escaping from slavery, Douglass came to the forefront of the abolitionist movement as a naturally gifted orator and powerful narrator of his experiences in slavery. His first autobiography, published in 1845, was so widely read that it was reprinted in 9 editions and translated into several languages. He traveled to Great Britain in 1845 and met with famous British abolitionists like Thomas Clarkson, drumming up moral and financial support from British and Irish anti-slavery societies. He was neither the first nor the last runaway slave to make this voyage, but his great success abroad contributed significantly to rousing morale among weary abolitionists at home. The model of resistance to the slave power only became more pronounced after 1850, when a long-standing Fugitive Slave Act was given new teeth. Through a legal mandate to return runaway slaves that had existed in the U.S. federal law since 1793, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 upped the ante by harshly penalizing officials who failed to arrest runaways and private citizens who tried to help them. This law, coupled with growing concern over the possibility that slavery would be allowed in Kansas when it was admitted as a state, made the 1850s a highly volatile and violent period of American anti-slavery. Reform took a back seat as armed mobs protected runaway slaves in the North and fortified abolitionists engaged in bloody skirmishes in the West, culminating in John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. The violence of the 1850s convinced many Americans that the issue of slavery was pushing the nation to the brink of sectional cataclysm. After 2 decades of immediatist agitation, the idealism of revivalist perfectionism had given way to the protracted battle for the moral soul of the country. For all the problems that abolitionists faced, the movement was far from a failure. The prominence of African Americans in abolitionist organizations offered a powerful, if imperfect, moral for interracial coexistence. While immediatists always remained a minority, their efforts paved the way for the moderately anti-slavery Republican Party to gain traction in the years preceding the Civil War. It's hard to imagine that Abraham Lincoln could have become president in 1860 without the ground prepared by anti-slavery advocates, without the presence of radical abolitionists against whom he could be cast as a moderate alternative. Although it ultimately took a civil war to break the bonds of slavery in the United States, the evangelical moral compass of revivalist Protestantism provided motivation for the embattled abolitionists. And in our last section, we're going to talk about women's rights in antebellum America. In this era of revivalism and reform, Americans understood the family and home as the hearthstones of civic virtue and moral influence. This increasingly confined middle-class white women to domestic sphere, where they were responsible for educating children and maintaining household virtue. Yet women took the ideology that defined their place in the home and managed to use it to fashion a public role for themselves. As a result, women actually became more visible and active in the public sphere than ever before. The influence of the Second Great Awakening, coupled with new educational opportunities available to girls and young women, enabled white middle-class women to leave their homes en masse, joining and forming societies dedicated to anything from literary interest to the anti-slavery movement. Now understand that in the early 19th century, for quiz purposes, the dominant understanding of gender claimed that women were guardians of virtue and spiritual heads of the home. Women were expected to be pious, pure, submissive, and domestic, and to pass these virtues on to their children. Historians have described these expectations as the cult of domesticity, or the cult of true womanhood. They developed in tandem with industrialization, the market revolution, and the Second Great Awakening. These economic and religious transformations increasingly seem to divide the world into a public space of work and politics and the domestic space of leisure and morality. Voluntary work related to labor laws, prison reform, anti-slavery applied women's roles as guardians of moral virtue to address all forms of social issues that they felt contributed to the moral decline of society. In spite of this apparent valuation of women's position in society, there were clear limitations. Under the terms of coverture, men gained legal control over their wives' property, and women with children had no legal rights over their offspring. Additionally, women could not initiate divorce, make wills, sign contracts, or vote. Female education provides an example of the great strides made by and for women during the antebellum period. As part of a larger education reform movement in the early republic, several female reformers worked tirelessly to increase women's access to education. They argued that if women were to take charge of the education of their children, they needed to be well educated themselves. While the women's education movement did not generally push for women's political or social equality, it did assert that women's intellectual equality with men, and the idea would eventually have important effects. Educators such as Emma Willard, Catherine Beecher, and Mary Lyons adopted the same rigorous curriculum that was used for boys. Many of these schools that they founded had the particular goal of training women to be teachers. Many graduates of these prominent seminaries would found their own schools, spreading women's education across the country, and with it, the ideas about women's potential to take part in the public life. The abolitionist movement was another important school for women's public engagement. Many of the earliest women's rights advocates began their activism by fighting the injustices of slavery, which you might want to remember for quiz purposes. And these included Angelina and Sarah Grimke, Lucretia Mott, Sojourner Truth, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Susan B. Anthony. In the 1830s, women in cities such as Boston, New York, and Philadelphia established female societies dedicated to the anti-slavery cause. Initially, these societies were similar to the prayer and fundraising-based projects of the Reform Societies. Such societies proliferated, however, their strategies began to change. Women could not vote, for example, and they began to express their anti-slavery grievances to the government. Impassioned women like the Grimke sisters began to travel on lecture circuits, and this later strategy, born of fervent anti-slavery advocacy, ultimately tethered the cause of women's rights to abolitionism. Sarah Moore Grimke and Angelina Emily Grimke were born to a wealthy family in Charleston, South Carolina. They witnessed the horrors of slavery firsthand, and while they did not push directly, and they witnessed the horrors of slavery firsthand, they decided to share their experience with lecture tours in the North. They were the first women to take such a prominent role in the name of reform and faced harsh criticisms. This inspired them to speak out on more than just slavery, which inspired other women to do the same. And before long, many women were linking the success of the abolition movement to the success of women in all areas. When Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton attended the Anti-Slavery Convention in London and experienced the genderism that they faced at the meeting, they returned home with a new sense of drive for women's rights. In 1848, they organized the Seneca Falls Convention, where women came together to discuss what could be done for women's rights. At this meeting, Stanton wrote the Declaration of Sentiments for the Seneca Falls Convention to capture the wide range of issues embraced by early women's rights movement. She modeled the document on the Declaration of Independence to make explicit the connection between women's liberty and the rhetoric of America's founding. The Declaration of Sentiments outlined 15 grievances and 11 resolutions that championed property rights, access to professions, and most controversially, the right to vote. 68 women and 32 men, all of whom were already involved in some aspect of reform, signed this declaration. Antebellum women's rights fought for what they perceived as senseless gender discrimination, such as barring women from college and inferior pay for female teachers, and argued that men and women should be held to the same moral standards. The Seneca Falls Convention was the first of many such gatherings promoting women's rights, held almost exclusively in northern states. Yet women's rights movement grew slowly and experienced few victories. Few states reformed married women's property laws before the Civil War, and no state was prepared to offer women the right to vote during the antebellum period. At the onset of the Civil War, women's rights advocates temporarily threw the bulk of their support behind abolition, allowing the cause of racial equality to temporarily trump that of gender equality. But the words of the Seneca Falls Convention continued to inspire generations of activists.